So during a recent race meeting, something really unusual happened.
Well, we've laid a whopping bet, I Am Maximus, Brian. Absolutely whopping. The biggest bet we've ever laid, yeah?
So at first glance, you could write this off as just a bit of hype. But there was an interesting aspect to this particular little interview that was done, because it exploded all over the internet on the particular day. But if you knew what you were doing, there was a really good way of being able to profit from this. But also, it tells you a lot about what goes on at a racecourse. So in the video that you saw in the short interview that we showed, you can actually see that what's happening is they're interviewing an on-course bookmaker, and go up and down the country on any particular day and you will find an on-course bookmaker making up prices for any of the horses within that particular race and taking bets. Now, most of these bookmakers will do relatively small amounts of money, but at the big meetings they can take very large bets, because a lot of these bookmakers also have offices and can do bets online, and they have client accounts and so on. So it's not impossible that somebody can walk up, get a price and place a bet, which will then funnel all the way back to head office. But typically that's not what happens. You go into a race course, you have your fivers and your tenors, you go up to bookmaker and you place a bet. However, that's not completely the whole story. So in days of old, if you went on course to place a bet, you would find that that was what drove the market. All of the bookmakers would communicate with each other using a form of sign language to tell each other what horse was available at what odds, and they would sort of share information amongst themselves, and that's what would drive the pricing for that particular market. It was all done on course and then communicated typically by phone to all of the bookmakers and all of the shops, and that's how all of the prices were set.
The odds on Willie or Won't He are now a far cry from the opening 20 to 1, or even the overnight 16 to 1 forecast. For Harry, the off means a job well done. The odds are down, others can watch the race.
Now, if you actually look at what happens nowadays, of course, you know, there was this thing called the internet that came along and laptops. And as a consequence, the source of that information and the way that a market was formed started to shift off course. And in fact, the market sort of gets driven the other way round nowadays. When betting exchanges were born, they began to become the arbiter of price and the central value within the market. And of course, if you were mispriced on course, then you could get picked off by somebody that would be able to lay off a bet on the exchange. So all of a sudden, this ecosystem developed around that, whereby bookmakers would actually have a laptop and an internet connection so that they could actually read the prices off the exchange, see what was going on, and then that would be reflected on their boards. And this was a way of them reducing the amount of risk and being able to get the current prices and not having to sort of communicate with other bookmakers. Everybody would know roughly what the price was. All they would do is add their little bit of margin on top of that. So yeah, the market shifted from being on course driving the prices and bookmakers having to communicate with each other that way, to prices being created pretty much off course and being driven down to the bookmaker. So we've learned already that pricing is now being driven off site and down to the course where bookmakers are throwing their margin on. But another thing happens as well that you need to be aware of, and that is that when we look, you know, one of the best ways of doing this is to actually examine this in action. Because if you go to a racecourse, what you'll find is loads of punters queuing up to place bets in between the races, and there'll be a bookmaker displaying all of their pricing, and somebody will be stood there accepting all of the bets, and they will give you a betting slip and away that you go. But at that point, if you go round the back of the board, you will often find somebody else there, and they will be sitting on a laptop looking at the entire market, seeing how many bets that they've actually taken, how much risk they've got in the entire book, and they will be entering all of that information in using live data from the betting exchange. And if they have a risk within the book that is just too large to bear, then they can always hedge that position off. Where are they going to hedge that off? Onto an exchange. And that's the way that the modern betting market works on course. Bookmakers can stand all of the liabilities that they have in the book, or if they feel a bit uncomfortable with it, they can actually hedge that position off and reduce their overall liability. If you want some really deep insight into exactly how this works, then I suggest you check out Simon Knott, who does a variety of things for himself and also for Star Sports. And he'll often follow Star Sports around, especially at big meetings, and he will give a running dialogue of exactly what positions Star Sports have on any particular race, if they've taken any large bets and so on. And it's a very deep insight into exactly what goes on at each individual meeting. There's nothing to be hidden there. And, it's great credit to Simon and Star Sports for allowing us to actually have a look at what's going on behind the scenes. And if you want to see this unfold at any particular meeting, very often you'll find Simon Knott and Star Sports giving you a running dialogue.
Where's the money going?
Well, we've laid a whopping bet, I Am Maximus, Brian. Absolutely whopping. The biggest bet we've ever laid, yeah.
A whopping bet?
A whopper, yeah.
When you say a whopper, what is a whopper?
A whopper is 6-figure bet at 8 to 1.
Come on, Johnny, tell us what is it?
There it is, there, look, have a look.
Oh my God, 100,000 at 8 to 1 and I Am Maximus. That's what you call a proper bet.
Yeah, that's the biggest bet we've ever laid by a mile anyway. So we'll have to do a bit of trading with it later on. We don't intend to stand it for 800,000 at the same time. But
what do you mean by that?
So the interview that ITV Racing did was not only a high-profile race and a high-profile meeting, it was the Grand National. And what we learnt from the interview was that we'd taken a £100,000 bet at 8 to 1 on I Am Maximus, the favourite at the Grand National. So now that you've got a little bit more knowledge, what do you think you would do if you're in that position? Because you obviously don't have to stand the bet if you don't want to. You could say to somebody, sorry, I'm not taking a bet for £100,000, but I will take a tenner. But obviously, this must have been an important client to them because they decided to take the £100,000 bet. And as a consequence, their book would have been very unbalanced. They would have had a massive loss if I Am Maximus went on to win, which it did. But they could have had a massive profit if it didn't go on to win. So if you put yourself in the situation of the bookmaker, what would you have done? Would you have just stood that bet and stood to lose a very significant amount of money? Or would you have hedged that position and reduced your liability on to the exchange? Because that gives you an insight as to what they had to face, but it also gives you an insight as to why bookmakers would hedge on an exchange. If you're going to stand a massive liability, it's probably better to get rid of some of that risk at some particular point in time. And that is exactly what they did. So on every race I've ever traded, I always capture data, and that is so I can look back at it, understand what happened, see if I could have done better, was there anything that I missed, and so on. And this is a chart of the Grand National, and more specifically I Am Maximus, which was the horse that this bookmaker laid £100,000 at odds of 8. So just the same way that you would do if you were hedging, if you were arbing, matched betting, whatever you're doing. If you back something at very large odds, you have to lay it. So if the bookmaker has laid I Am Maximus for £100,000, to hedge that position somewhat, they're going to have to back it. And let me describe what you can see on the chart here. The line is showing the last traded price. So you can see it's 10.5 here, blipped up to 11, 10.5, 10, 10.5, 10. So you can see it's roughly the same. But this is sort of a typical Grand National market. The prices don't tend to move that much at all. And underneath you can see the volume here. This is how much money was being bet on I Am Maximus. So you can see £300,000, and you can see the money's gradually coming in for the favourite. Again, nothing unexpected, and you can see it beginning to rise as we get closer to post time. Again, that's nothing unexpected. And you can see we're just under half an hour before the start of the race. So bearing in mind that the bookmaker has laid £100,000, if they want to hedge some of that liability, they're going to have to back some of that £100,000. So you tell me what happened to the price of I Am Maximus. Because if I extend the chart a little bit further here, we'll begin to see what happened to the price activity and the volume. So can you see that at around 15.50, we started to see a lot of heavy backing, and of course the volume went shooting up because of that. And you can see the price on I Am Maximus started to come in. So if I extend that a little bit further, you can see there was a temporary period here where the price bounced back out, but you can see that the heavy backing continued right and to the off. There was a whiff of panic in this market. The amount of money available on I Am Maximus was getting taken, and every single bit of money that was available was getting backed. So you could see that somebody was hedging, or something was going on within this particular market. Price remained stable for absolutely ages. And then you can see 10 minutes before the start of the race,
the backing starts. It starts to pull the price into 9, and then 8, 7, and then you can see there's a little blip here as the price starts to go back out, but the backing then continues again, 7, 6, and with slightly past post time here, 5, 5.7, and then the race actually goes in play. So the activity you can see in the market here is backing. We know it's backing because it's pulling the price in. You can see it's on volume, so you can see it's real backing. Somebody is taking out all of the prices on the backside of the market. That is pulling the price down. And if it was somebody that was hedging, then they would be attempting to hedge a lay bet, which is exactly the situation that we saw within the market. It was telegraphed well on social media. They sort of showed their hand. And a lot of the time on the Grand National, you could have just sat there and waited for this activity to start and jumped on the back of it, knowing full well that there's very few people that would be able to stand a £100,000 bet at odds of 8, so they would probably have to hedge it off at some position into the future. And that was where your opportunity lays, because you could have obviously backed it at a much higher price, laid it off at a much lower price, and netted the profit between the two.
So this story is interesting for two reasons. One is a lot of people don't realise that that's how the on-course market works now. Those prices are probably coming from the exchange with a bit of margin for the bookmaker, which is fair enough. But the thing that people don't realise is that actually if you place a bet with them, they could just hedge it off straight away. But a lot of bookmakers do actually let their bets stand because that's what they're in business for. They'll take a view on whether they think a favourite is a good favourite or not. And they can, over the long term, make a lot more money that way than they can typically from hedging. But when somebody places a large bet, then obviously that's probably a position that needs to be hedged. And if you keep your eyes and ears open and you see something like this happening, then if they do start to hedge it on the exchange, you will see exactly the situation that we saw with I Am Maximus at the Grand National. And from a trading perspective, that means that you can actively profit from it. And of course, the Grand National is one of my favourite trading races. I did profit from it. I just wasn't expecting such a strong move for I Am Maximus. I think they left it a little bit late to feed that money into the market. And there was a whiff of panic when you saw this price began to move. You could feel it within the market. But nonetheless, if you see a situation like this develop in the future, or you see a set of gambles occurring, then this is very often what drives the price on an exchange. And if you know that, then you can profit from it too.